I'm Doug Knoll, and in this lecture, I am going to introduce you to the idea of how to negotiate any problem without compromising. Most of us have learned some rudimentary negotiation, and we've learned that in order to get what we want, sometimes we have to give stuff up. But there is a way to negotiate where you don't have to give anything up and get everything that you need from the other person. And that's what I want to introduce you to today. So the first thing to think about is the limits of traditional negotiation. Many people believe, incorrectly, that negotiation is based on the idea that we are maximizing our utility. We're rational beings and we're going to negotiate to get what we want because we can improve our economic position. As it turns out, we are 98% emotional and 2% rational. And most negotiation is therefore an emotional process, not a rational process. The problem is that in systems of decision making, such as the legal system, everything is reduced down to money. And so when there is negotiation, it is negotiation about money and not about the underlying real issues that might be driving a conflict or driving a dispute or creating a problem. And in fact, money becomes a band-aid and a substitute for much, much deeper issues, which leads to tragedy because if we have to negotiate over core values, for example, maybe we have people with differences, deep-seated differences in what they believe in, and those core values have to be reconciled somehow. Or perhaps people have suffered a deep and abiding injustice that can't be solved with money. It can only be solved with some other process. These are not amenable to dollar negotiations, and they're not amenable to compromise. So there has to be another way. And in fact, this story came out back in 2004, right after the Boston Archdiocese settled the clergy sexual abuse claims for something on the order of $84 million. A number of the people who had been injured and abused received some money from that lawsuit, but since they didn't get the closure, some committed suicide, like Patrick McSorley. And it shows you the devastation that can occur in a conflict where if all we talk about is the money, we're really not addressing the underlying problem. And this applies not only in disputes where money is at stake, but other kinds of disputes too, as we'll see in just a minute. So what do we do, for example, when somebody has a really strong need for revenge or retribution? They feel vengeance, really strong vengeance. And what do we do when people are highly emotional? What do we do when people are, they're just not able to do anything except take a positional approach? That's when we want to start considering interest-based negotiation. Interest-based negotiation is a problem-solving process where the parties work to satisfy interests rather than positions. And I'll give you the 5 steps to this, and we'll go through these steps in a little bit of detail. Take notes, and of course go back and replay this lesson if you miss stuff, or you can pause and take notes as you go along. This is just an introduction to the idea. It is a practice that I use in my mediation practice successfully for over 20 years in taking parties where money is not the true issue to a place where they can actually reach agreement without compromise. So the first step in any interest-based negotiation is to introduce some ground rules. And I actually recommend introducing ground rules in any kind of problem-solving discussion. The 5 ground rules that I use are as follows. Number 1, one person speaks at a time without interruption. Oftentimes I'll tell people you will hear things that you really don't like, but zip your lip, take notes, because everybody will have an opportunity to speak. Please do not interrupt another person when that person is speaking. My second ground rule often is please reflect back what you have heard the other speaker say and feel. So this is where you get into more deep listening. And the third ground rule is speak your truth. The fourth ground rule is be respectful. So that means your body language, your tone of voice, and the words you choose should be respectful to yourself, to the other side, and to the whole process. And the last ground rule is that the process must be fair. So that if any time anybody feels like the negotiation is unfair, they should call that out so that you all can address the problems before you move on. Once everybody agrees to the ground rules, then it's often useful for people to share perspectives. What is it that is bringing them to the table? How do they see the problem? How did the problem start? What are they hoping for in terms of not a solution, but how is their life going to change if they can get the problem solved? So we want to do some storytelling and some listening and some perspective taking. After that has occurred, we're going to move into trying to identify what the problem really is. And here is where interest-based negotiation really differs from, say, distributive negotiation or other kinds of negotiation that you might be familiar with. In this step, we are going to identify interests, injustices, and polarities. We're going to be talking in a moment about interests versus positions. Injustices typically represent relationship and identity goals, and polarities typically are unsolvable problems. I'll give you a little bit more information about that in just a moment. So let's first of all take a look at interests and positions. So you got to give an issue. Let's say that you have to negotiate with your teenage daughter about the use of the car. She wants to use the car on Saturday night. And so if you were to look at an issue, the issue would be who decides who gets to use the car on Saturday night. So each of you can have a position. For example, her position is, I want the car Saturday night so I can go out to a party with my friends. And your position is, no, you can't have the car on Saturday night. You can go with your friends, but you can't take the car. Well, have the car, not have the car, you'll all of a sudden notice there's not a lot of room for compromise there. And that's the problem with positional negotiation, is that the only way that positions can get reconciled is through compromise. And if the issue is deep-seated enough, people are going to be unwilling to compromise on their positions, and that makes conflicts become more intractable and more difficult. But if we look at something a little different, if we look at this problem differently, we'll see that there is a way to get around this positional impasse that occurs, and that is to go beneath the positions and look at the interests that would be satisfied if a particular position were accepted. So the way I describe it is to say the position is the solution to the issue. The interests are what would be satisfied, all the good things that would happen in life if you got your own way. So if I were negotiating with my daughter over use of the car on Saturday night, instead of saying, no, you can't have the car, I would say, well, if you had the car, what would be all the good things that would happen to you? And I would want to get her to list out all the good things that would happen to her. I'd have my freedom. I could be with my friends. I'd be able to do what I want to do. I'd have some autonomy. I could get home on time. I wouldn't have to worry about depending on friends or Uber or anything else. So those are all good interests. And then I might state my interests. I might say we would have to put gas in the car. I don't like you driving at night with friends. If you're going to a party where there's alcohol involved, and I worry about the danger, I have an interest in seeing you be safe and responsible, and so forth and so on. So now we see these interests out there, and once we get the interests identified, we can start working with them. Another thing we can do, and here you'll see that in this diagram really explains positions versus interests pretty clearly. You can see that typically positions represent about the tip of the iceberg. And what we really need to be doing is going underneath and looking deeper at what the interests are that the positions represent. And this is the core piece of interest-based negotiation, looking at interests rather than just accepting positions. Another thing that we can do in interest-based negotiation is deal with injustices. And what we have here are the three legs of the distributive justice tool. Now, there are many, many different kinds of justice, and I actually have a YouTube video up that if you go to my YouTube channel, you'll find Doug Noll on justice. You could probably Google it too. And it's an hour-long lecture on, actually, it's a long lecture, hour and a half lecture on all the different kinds of justice out there and what they are. But the kind of justice I want to talk about today is distributive justice, equity, equality, and need. So equity says that justice is measured by I eat what I kill. In other words, what I contribute to the group is what I'm entitled to take out of the group. So if I'm many thousands of years ago go out and kill the big hairy woolly mammoth and take all the risk, I should get the first and biggest piece of meat off the fire because I was the one that put out the effort to kill the hairy woolly mammoth and drag that haunch back to camp. Equality says that, well, wait, Doug, we're all equal members of our clan here, and just because you got lucky and killed that hairy woolly mammoth and dragged that haunch back in doesn't mean that you're going to be able to do that every day. So because we're all equal adults in the clan, we all have an equal claim on that hairy woolly mammoth haunch that you brought in. And so that's equality. Need says, oh, wait a minute, we also have children, and we have some people who are sick, and we have people who are elderly that need to be taken care of. And they have a claim on that hairy woolly mammoth haunch. So each of these three aspects of distributive justice have to be balanced. And it's all subjective, and we know in our hearts when things are in balance and when things are out of balance. And by the way, if you want to look at this in a larger picture, justice without these three being in balance creates a lot of problems. For example, untrammeled equity would be capitalism without any restriction, which means that you end up with oligarchy. Equality, untrammeled and unrestricted, would mean socialism and, in the worst case, communism, which completely destroys the idea of innovation and people working towards compensation according to effort. And needs the same thing. If the need demand becomes greater than the resources of the community, then it doesn't matter how much equity and equality you have, you go bankrupt. So keeping these things in balance at both a family clan level and also at a community level is really important. The last thing that we can concern ourselves with are polarities. So the example I like to give is imagine a management team in a company, and a consultant comes in and says, well, the problem you've got here is you don't have enough entrepreneurial attitude. You're all in teams, and these teams are conservative and nobody's being innovative. So you need to take all of your team people and turn them into individualistic entrepreneurs. And so the company does that. And then 6 months later, another consultant comes in and says, well, the problem is that there's no coordination here. It's complete chaos because you've got all these people running around and acting like entrepreneurs. You really need more team effort, and you need people coordinated, and you need more leadership and a little bit more hierarchy. So they revert back to a more authoritarian, hierarchical form of managing people. Well, those are polarities. One classic polarity is entrepreneurialism on the one side and teamwork on the other. And you can never reconcile those two. They are just two poles of an idea of working. And what you want to do when you've got a polarity is manage the best part of the polarity, which is you want to manage, for example, the best part of having people being entrepreneurial, which is that they're creative and innovative. And you want to manage the best part of teamwork, which is that you can coordinate and get more done with people pulling together. And you want to also manage the negative sides of entrepreneurialism, which would be chaos and craziness, and teamwork, which would be too rigidity and authoritarianism. You want to manage those out of the process. So if you are dealing with interests that appear to be polarities, then you have to look at how you're going to manage those polarities in a different way. But again, if you are just focused on positions, you might not ever see that what you've got here is a polarity that has to be managed in a different way than something else. If one person says we need entrepreneurialism and the other person says no, we need teamwork, and they're positional on that, what they don't realize is that they're arguing from different poles of the same continuum. And so we can use interest-based negotiation to figure out how to work with that polarity. All right, so once you've identified your interests, you need to ask two critical questions. First, does the satisfaction of any interest or injustice exclude the satisfaction of any other interest? So that if I'm looking at my daughter's interests in taking the car on Saturday night, and I am looking at my interests, what I want to see is, are there any of these interests mutually exclusive, such that the satisfaction of one interest would mean that the other interest can't be satisfied? And you know, I've done this over 2,000 times over the last 20 years, and I have never, ever, ever seen two interests that are mutually exclusive. But you have to ask the question, because the people that you're negotiating with oftentimes can't believe that there are interests out there that can be satisfied that don't compete with each other. And it's really fascinating to watch. Very powerful. Then finally, you want to get a commitment question. If all of the interests are satisfied, do we have the basis for an agreement? And you need to get a yes on this one. If you don't get a yes, then you have to ask the question, what is missing? What has to be added up here in order for you to say, yes, we have the basis for an agreement? This helps get rid of the hidden agendas. It helps get rid of nibbling. And it makes sure that people are really committed to a cooperative problem-solving process. So step 4, after you've identified interests, injustices, and polarities, is to generate options. And basically, the way I do this is state that each person has to generate 3 options. Each option must address all interests, injustices, and polarities. And I put a high premium on creativity and humor. An option is not a bid, it's not a concession, it's not a proposal. It's just, here's one way the problem could be solved. And the most important thing about these options are that they satisfy not only your interests, but they also satisfy the interests of the other side. And then what you do is you take a look at those options and you start talking and you say, well, what works here, what doesn't work? And you begin to move towards an agreement, where you basically decide how you're going to solve the problem. Typically, you'll find that no single option will be sufficient by itself. So what you're going to do is take the best ideas from all the options and put them into some kind of framework and see if you can't come up with something that will work for both of you, satisfying all the interests. The test of a great agreement in an interest-based negotiation is whether or not the agreement satisfies all of the interests of all of the people involved, and that is the secret. So in summary, interest-based negotiation tends to preserve relationships because it is non-competitive in nature. It's collaborative and competitive, and it moves people from a competitive positional stance to a collaborative problem-solving stance in which relationships become important. It fosters cooperative problem solving over competitive power struggles so that you can use interest-based negotiation even when there's power imbalance. And finally, interest-based negotiation creates stronger agreements and stronger relationships because when people feel like their interests are being satisfied, they tend to do what they say they're going to do. And that's why interest-based negotiation is oftentimes more powerful than typical distributive negotiation, where you've got to make compromise and give up stuff in order to get what you want. So for more information on all of this and everything else that I do in my world, check out DougNoll.com. And you can also check out my YouTube channel, where there are a whole bunch of videos explaining all kinds of stuff that I'm interested in as a mediator, author, and visionary. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the other side.